Hi girls, so welcome to another video. So these two sets of videos is going to be on evidence for evolution. So as I said in class, we've done evidence before, we talked about in class, we did our stations, you did your homework packets. We're going to be looking now at some of the stations that you did during your activity, during your lab, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those stations, explain what things, for example, homologous structures, what exactly do they mean, analogous structures. And remember that all these things we're going to be looking at in this video are all types of evidence that supports this idea of what Darwin said, that we are all related, that life changes over time. So let's start with number one. So number one also happens to be station number one, and that is fossils. Okay, so as you guys know, I'm sure, fossils are the preserved remains. These are living things that used to live in the past. Not all living things actually end up becoming fossils. They say that only, 2 to 3% of any organism that has ever been alive actually ends up fossilizing. So a vast majority of life we don't have any record of. So even though the fossil record is really important, for us to see what living things look like long ago, we don't have fossils of everything. So a lot of it is a mystery, trying to put together a puzzle where you don't have all the pieces. But fossils are preserved remains of living things. Sometimes they're just markings, sometimes plant markings, and so forth. Another term often used when you're talking about fossils is something called the fossil record. And the fossil record is just the record, the recording of all the fossils we've found so far and putting them kind of in time order, chronological order. So you see oldest fossils, then the next oldest, and the next oldest. And by doing that, you can physically see as a visual how life has changed. You can see, if you remember from station one, the horses, how the skull size got bigger and the leg size got longer. Okay, so fossils help us visualize that. So in terms of the fossils that we do have, whether they're in museums or in research labs, we have found that the oldest fossils are most likely prokaryotic organisms. So if you think back to when we were doing cells, prokaryotic organisms, think of bacteria, very simple cells, no nucleus, no major organelles. And so that's a sign that the first living things that ever lived on our planet were probably very simple, tiny organisms. And that over time, they got bigger, they acquired more characteristics, and became more complex. So going from simple and becoming as complex as we are today. Something else that fossils have told us is that we believe, and we have evidence now, that life began in the sea. So organisms and life began originally in the sea, and eventually some of those organisms moved onto land. Some of them stayed in the sea, like fish, but mammals, reptiles, amphibians for the most part, birds, those are organisms, descendants, that eventually moved onto land. And as some of you guys found out, some of those organisms that moved onto land eventually began to go back into the sea, like our whale, which is pretty cool. Okay, so something also that's interesting is that 99% of all the species that has ever been alive, we don't even have anymore on our planet. They are extinct. So even though we have so much diversity of life on our planet, we're just a fraction, 1% of what was on our planet. So it's pretty amazing to think of what kind of life did exist on our planet before humans or before modern times. Okay, so that's number one. The second type of evidence was actually broken into a couple stations and is called comparative anatomy. Remember, comparing means to see similarities. Anatomy is body structure. And so the first term that many of you guys looked at in the stations is something called homologous structures. Think of homologous chromosomes. Homologous means similar. The word homology in your evidence packet for homework also means similar too, same word. Homologous structures are structures that have a common evolutionary origin. So if you look in this picture over here, so if you follow my mouse, here we have 4 examples of homologous structures. We have bats, whales, cats, and human. Now on the outside, they all are very different, right? So a human has an arm to grasp things, a cat walks on its feet, a whale swims, and a bat flies. So the function of homologous structures are often very different. But if you examine them really closely, what you'll notice, look at the color coding. The humerus in purple, it's found in humans, cats, a little bit smaller, kind of modified, but still found in whales, and in bats. The radius and the ulna, this is your forearm, found in all four, the carpals, the metacarpals, the fingers or phalanges. They're found, maybe they look a little bit different, but all these bones are found in what you would think are very different animals, which makes us realize that maybe they're not so different after all. And if you look at these organisms, they all happen to be mammals. So that's one of the reasons why we group animals in certain ways, not just from what they look like on the outside, but how they're built on the inside. Because how they're built means we must have inherited similar DNA sequences, similar instructions from a common ancestor. Analogous structures are a little bit more tricky. They are almost the opposite of homologous structures. If structures are analogous to each other, they actually don't mean they have a common evolutionary ancestor or a recent ancestor. It just means they look like they would be closely related, but they actually aren't. So these are structures that have the same function. So look, all these four organisms are flying. You have butterfly, you have a bird, a bat, I'm not really sure what this one is, but some sort of wing, probably from another bird. And so the function is the same, but if you look at them closely, sort of in your station, you'll notice, okay, some of them have bones. So maybe the bird and the bat are a little bit more homologous to each other. But if you compare to a butterfly wing, who does not have bones, they are analogous to each other. So analogous structures are structures that seem like they would be the same because they have a similar function, but they're built of different things, which means they probably only have the same function because they adapted to similar environments, not really because they have the same instructions genetically or they inherited a recent common ancestor. Their common ancestor is probably really far back in time. And the last one is vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are structures that used to be important at one time, maybe when a species was built a little bit differently or had different purposes, did maybe a different diet, but no longer are used, and they kind of are just there. They don't really do anything. And so an example of vestigial structures that we talked about in the stations, I did with most of you guys, is appendix. So an appendix is something most, if not everyone, has, and the only time you ever even notice your appendix is around is if it bursts. So people who have their appendix burst and have to have them operated on, if it gets inflamed or infected, that's really the only time you ever even notice your appendix. Otherwise, it just kind of sits in your body. It used to play a role in your digestive system. Early humans used to have slightly different diets, and so the appendix used to be an important part of that, and no longer. Okay, similarities in development. So this one was a pretty cool one. Basically, it's this idea that if we're able to study the embryos of organisms before they're even born, what we've noticed is that there's a lot of similarities. And a lot of you guys noticed this on the very first paper of the station, where in the very beginning, right after fertilization, it's almost impossible to tell apart what different animals are. So a gorilla, a rabbit, and a fish look almost identical. And then, of course, as they develop even more and more, they start to differentiate. It becomes much easier to see. But studying embryos actually has helped us realize, that two animals who might be very different, they actually do have some things in common, even if it's only for a fleeting moment, maybe for a few weeks, and they lose that as they develop even more. And one example of that is humans actually have gills like fish, in the very early stages of pregnancy, and then we very quickly lose them. But it's a piece of evidence that goes to show that we have some sort of relatedness. We have a common ancestor with fish. Okay, and the very last one is genetic evidence. So this is the station number 8 when you were comparing amino acid sequences. Basically, this is a more recent type of evidence we've been able to look at. If two species, if you look at their genetic sequences, so this could be a DNA sequence, A, C, T, T, G, and so forth, or maybe an amino acid sequence, like in your stations, to see how they make certain proteins. If you take two different species and you're able to do a DNA analysis or a protein analysis and you look at the sequence of how to make those molecules, if you see sequences that are very closely matched, almost hardly any differences, you would say that those two species have a relatively recent common ancestor. So for example, if you follow my mouse, the dragonfly and the beetle, well, if you follow the lines of their branches, where those two branches meet for those two organisms, that's where their common ancestor is believed to have emerged. And so a dragonfly and a beetle, I guess this would be where their common ancestor is. So kind of close to them. But if you want to compare a dragonfly to, say, a human, now look and see where their lines intersect, all the way down here. And so even though we have a common ancestor, it's way farther back in time. Okay, so humans and gorillas would be two examples of animals that have a relatively recent ancestor. So if you see humans and gorillas are right here, sort of like dragonflies and beetles. And the greater number of differences between species. So if you count amino acid sequences or DNA sequences and you see a lot of differences, well, it means their common ancestor must be much lower on the family tree, much older common ancestor, which means so much time has gone by to allow them to adapt and to acquire those differences in DNA sequences. Okay, and you guys can't see this because it's not showing up for some reason, but an example of two species that would have a much older common ancestor would be humans and fish, as opposed to humans and gorillas. Which kind of makes sense because humans and fish are clearly much more different physically than humans and gorillas. Okay, so this is the end of evidence. So I think I told one section that this would be 2 5-minute videos or so. I ended up just making one long video. So it'll be about 11 minutes or so. This last slide over here is pretty much just the same thing as you saw in the stations. You're just comparing a different protein. This one is hemoglobin. So comparing how many differences between each animal to humans. So comparing human to human, there's no difference because it's the same one, but comparing a gorilla's hemoglobin sequence to humans, there's one difference. Rhesus monkeys have 8 differences, mice have 27, chickens have 45, and frogs have 67. So the question I have for you to end this video with is, does that make sense? Does it make sense that we would have more differences with a chicken than we would a mouse? Or more differences with a mouse than we would a gorilla? And hopefully the answer is no, because you can see that we have more similarities with the animals we have less differences with. But these are the 4 major types of evidence you need to know for the exam. And I hope you liked the video. Okay, I'll see you guys on Friday. Bye-bye.